Okay, this video will be about Sartre's being the nothingness, the existence of others. So I just want to start with just a very brief review. If we remember from the beginning of being a nothingness, if we remember the foundation that we started with based on Cartesian doubt, Descartes can be mistaken about the content of his thinking, but he is certain of his existence because his thinking, his awareness, necessitates existence, and nothing else is indubitable beyond this, at least at first. Now Sartre takes this apart a bit and points out that on the level of the pre-reflective consciousness, to be and to know are the same thing. For Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think or I doubt, therefore I am, concerns the reflective consciousness. So the object is not Descartes, the object is not the I of I am, but rather it is the original consciousness of doubting that is being reflected on. Okay, he's not reflecting on himself, he's reflecting on this original consciousness of doubting. So when we reflect on our consciousness, we are positing it as an object. We cannot reflect on our consciousness as it is reflecting. We cannot reflect on the subject that we are as we are reflecting. We're like a dog chasing its tail. Now, remember that there is this chasm between subject and object. One way to remind ourselves of what we mean when we use the words subject and object is to think in terms of witness and witnessed. As Descartes reflects on his doubt, he posits it as an object. When we witness our own thoughts, we are separated from them by a nothingness. This is important to keep in mind as Sartre deals with the issue of others and advances his view from his predecessors. So with Sartre, the pre-reflective cogito is primary. The nature of our pre-reflective consciousness for Sartre is such that to be and to know are one and the same. Now, Sartre uses many terms made important by Kantian philosophy, especially the distinction between the noumena and the phenomena. Phenomena are appearances, we know this by now. The noumena are things in themselves. And we might be tempted to say that we are noumenal in the sense that we have this interiority. We have this point of view that seems to rest just behind our eyes. But Sartre is pointing out that we don't ever know ourselves in the capacity of a knowing being. With reflection, we step outside of ourselves. We posit our thoughts, our consciousness as an object, and it remains locked outside of us as an object, on the other side of this chasm. With temporality, we are dispersed in the past and in the future, and we cannot collect ourselves as a totality in order to see ourselves fully, to see ourselves as we are embedded in the continuity of being. And we realize through the other that we have a self that is for the other, a self we cannot access. The other sees us from the outside, the other sees us as an object, but this object is inaccessible to our intuition or to our direct experience. These are the three ecstasies: reflection, temporality, and being for others. We've covered reflection and we've covered temporality. Now we're getting into being for others. The diasporic way is the word that Sartre used. The diasporic way in which we step outside of ourselves through reflection, temporality, and being for others, in part explains why we don't apprehend our totality in itself. So why is Sartre examining the problem of others so closely? The questions here are: how do we account for the other? To what extent can we know the other? And to what extent do we know ourselves by knowing the other? Essentially, what does the other mean for our existence? Ultimately, what Sartre is revealing is the way in which we fail to escape the privacy of our own minds, how we fail to see ourselves through the other's point of view, and how the other negates the world as it is through our point of view. That is what a lot of this chapter is about. And Sartre begins by discussing shame, the feeling of shame. So the presence of the other is required for shame, and it's not reflective, meaning that shame is not independently produced by reflecting on oneself. Rather, it is the presence of the other that elicits an awareness of oneself as an object. And this is an important point, and we'll get back to this. Shame is shame of oneself before the other. The other reveals myself to me. The other reveals us and establishes us in a new mode of being, and it stands separately from being for itself. And I think that's worth talking about. Being for others is a mode of being. It is a structure of our consciousness. It resides in us. And this is important in distinguishing Sartre's ideas from his predecessors, and it's important to in understanding the issue of solipsism. So Sartre discusses solipsism in length because, again, we are assessing the other in terms of knowledge. Now, solipsism is the understanding that one could only be sure of his or her mind. There is no way of proving the existence of other minds. It seems straightforward why this is an issue. There's no way to penetrate the density of the other's body to inhabit his or her point of view. I mean, if you just think of being, again, I'd like to use this example of being a neuroscientist. You could measure all kinds of things going on in someone's brain. And you may even be able to determine, the content of what that person's feeling or thinking or whatever. But you're not stepping inside their shoes. You're not seeing the world the way they see it. So we're dealing with this question of whether we instantiate the other as certain the way Descartes believes he has established himself as certain by virtue of his thinking. So we have this foundation, this indubitable certainty of existence. Can we extend this certainty to the other? Now, the short answer is no, not on the level of knowledge. Ultimately, Sartre will make the case that an entire structure of our consciousness is for others. And on an ontological level, we have a kind of a certainty of the other. But on the level of knowledge, which is a subject-object relation, I cannot prove that the other has an internal experience just like mine. After all, the other could be a sophisticated robot, and that could be fooled into thinking that the other is real. Obviously, no one thinks that the other is just an illusion. The point is to demonstrate that the directness of experience and the certainty that comes with it is broken when we appraise the existence of the other. Therefore, knowledge of the other is probable, as opposed to indubitable. Even though I cannot prove the existence of the other, I'm going to move on with my life without worrying about it too much. So a lot of the early part of this chapter fleshes this out. Sartre outlines a chain of soul to body, body to soul. So there's this exteriority here. Sartre writes on 304, if souls are separated by their bodies, they are distinct, as this inkwell is distinct from this book. That is, we cannot conceive of the immediate presence of the one in the other. So Sartre points out that when we describe the intentions of another person, the motivations, we use the expression as if. So he gestured as if. His expression was as if. And these two words illuminate the disconnection between minds. This is yet another example of what Sartre is uncovering from language. We use the words as if because we already know what Sartre is talking about. After all, we live it, we are it. This entire project is like biting your own teeth. And while it takes some teasing out, it reveals a beauty to the ordinary way in which we make sense of the world. The other belongs to the category of as if, and that encapsulates the disconnection with the other. It is also worth noting that Sartre refers to the for itself instead of the individual because he's referring to the complex of structures that make up human consciousness. And as we've already covered, the for itself steps outside of itself through a reflection, through temporality, and now through being for others. And as we remember, a self-conscious being is a being that is what it is not and not what it is. In other words, it's not a fixed thing in the world. So by referring to the for itself, Sartre gets past the contradictory nature of an individual and can build a description of this self-conscious human being on firmer ground. These are reasons not to refer to the for itself as simply synonymous with the individual or the self, as these words are used in common parlance. We're being more precise than that. We're talking about consciousness. Sartre discusses the issue of solipsism first through the realist lens. Now, realism is a broad term. It refers to reality independent of mentality. So realism posits the external world as a given. It is more than a mere phenomena. The other exists in the external world, and for the realist, the other is a mere representation, in the sense that the other's body is a representation of his thinking substance. The problem with realism is that for it to break out of the solipsism of a single mind, there would need to be a complete transparency between the mind of the other and its representation in the body of the other. And Sartre also criticizes behaviorists through this lens. In other words, nothing could be hidden between the gestures and expressions of the other and the internal experience those gestures correspond to. So realism doesn't break us out of the problem of solipsism. This is why we use the words as if to describe the behavior of others. We're not sure if that gesture corresponds to that thought. He gestured as if he were angry. He smiled as if he were happy. But we don't really know what's going on in the interiority of someone else's mind. Now, idealism sees everything in terms of mentality or consciousness. For the idealist, consciousness is fundamental. You could roughly sketch out the difference between realism and idealism as starting with Plato and Aristotle. The Platonic forms are idealists in the sense that they refer to an abstract realm where the perfect tree exists or the perfect form of anything exists. And this is mental in nature. If you think of Raphael's School of Athens, Aristotle is pointing at the ground towards reality, and Plato points at the sky towards the abstract, towards spirit, towards Geist. Realism, as it sounds, affirms the existence of things independent of our consciousness. There is a world, and it doesn't need mentality to exist. Idealism affirms everything is consciousness. Idealism could take many forms. For the idealist Bishop Berkeley, our witnessing of things makes them so. And you may remember Sartre using the Latin phrase "sas percipi," which Sartre borrows from Berkeley, and which means to be is to be perceived. Berkeley's idealism held that what exists because it is perceived. It is ultimately God that perceives everything at once, thereby allowing all that exists to have a stability, regardless of whether a person is perceiving it or not. But there are other idealist philosophies. For example, if I were to say that all things in and of themselves are made of consciousness, then I'm taking a step further than merely stating that my perception of objects makes them so. Analytic idealism conceives of matter as an external appearance of consciousness. One way to think about this would be to imagine looking at someone's brain. Again, I'm using this example. If you're looking at someone's brain activity through a CAT scan or whatever, and they're thinking certain thoughts and feeling certain emotions, that the material activity that we witness appears as any other form of activity in the external world. We're talking about combinations and permutations of different dendrites and neurons firing off. But internally, this activity exists as the thoughts and emotions of the conscious being to which the brain corresponds to. There's Hegel's idealism, which rests on his notion of spirit or Geist, which accounts for all things as embedded in this Geist, this spirit, because we understand things by placing them into a dialectical relation with other things. We often hear of thesis, antithesis, synthesis as being associated with this. And we can understand why we need to contrast things from what they are different from in order to see them for what they are, in order to see them in relation to other things. So as we understand anything, we end up embedding it into Geist. We see everything in terms of everything else. And in this sense, we depart from the static reality of things, and we grasp more and more how things exist as part of a process of development, which we partake in as well. And from this, we begin to trace an evolution of consciousness that extends beyond the individual's consciousness to encompass a larger sense of consciousness or Geist. And with the master-slave dialectic, the conflict between the self and the other, you have this dialectical relation bringing about self-consciousness, which we'll get into shortly. Then, of course, there's Kant's transcendental idealism. I think it's worth just kind of going over some of this. Kant's transcendental idealism, it's transcendental in that it looks beyond space and time, and it's idealist in the sense that only ideas or appearances can be known. That key word being known here. Kant's transcendental idealism incorporates an understanding of both realism and idealism, a mix of Aristotle and Plato, or a Hume and Leibniz, one might say. Kant understands that the things of the world have their own discrete existence independent of our perception of them, and he would also admit that we cannot see the objects of the world for what they are in and of themselves, but he sorts out how reason makes experience intelligible to us. The things of this world conform to our perceptive and intellectual apparatus. Now, Sartre is not an idealist. He sees reality as having its own existence outside of consciousness, but there's no way of truly apprehending this reality independently of perception. And this is consistent with Kant. Kant is sometimes described as an idealist. After all, his system is called transcendental idealism, but he's not saying that mentality or consciousness is fundamental. Kant would say that our knowledge of things are ultimately mental. In other words, we cannot have knowledge of things as they are in themselves. We have knowledge of appearances, and appearances are mental. Phenomenology, the study of appearances, discusses the world as it appears, and appearances belong to mentality. Idealists just make an extra assumption on the nature of reality by positing it as made of consciousness. Materialists believe that matter is simply matter, or dead stuff, whereas for the idealist, matter is consciousness. It's just the external appearance of it. Sartre, again, is examining a reality, the true form of which is hidden behind the density of being. Okay, so now, I hope that's not too confusing. I just thought I'd sketch out our different notions of these terms, so we kind of have a better sense of what we're reading when we get into the text, Sartre's text. So back to the issue of solipsism. The internal reality of the other cannot simultaneously affect me. Okay, there's nothing fixed in parallel between the experience of the other and my experience. Everything we know about the other is probable. It is based on a hypothesis. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. Sartre writes that the perception of the other as object refers to a system of representations, and this system is not mine. This means that in my experience, the other is not a phenomenon which refers to my experience, but that on principle he refers to a phenomena located outside of all experience, which is possible for me. End quote. So normally when we see objects, we define them by our system of representations, meaning that the glass of water is illuminated by our thirst. The hammer is illuminated by our goal of building something with wood. The objects of the world are defined by how they advance us towards our own pursuit, towards fulfilling our lack. Now, with the other, suddenly objects can be defined according to an entirely different system of meaning that cannot be directly understood. In fact, the other system negates my own, as I am seen as an object by the other. Sartre writes on 307, and when I list these page numbers, I'm referring to Hazel Barnes' edition, translation. Sartre writes, "These phenomena," referring to the ensemble of expressions and gestures of the other, "unlike all others, do not refer to possible experiences, but to experiences which on principle are outside my experience and belong to a system which is inaccessible to me." So when we apprehend the other, we have probable knowledge that they are conscious as we are. This consciousness, however, is inaccessible. We see the other as an object, and this object is met in the world of objects. And as we recall from previous chapters, we understand objects in terms of our situation, in terms of our pursuit. Now, this object, the other, is a subject that sees me as an object, but we cannot see him as a subject. Therefore we cannot access ourselves through the other. We cannot see through the other's eyes. We cannot stand in their shoes. We cannot see ourselves as a totality in continuity with everything else. We cannot see how we fit into the bigger picture. We cannot step outside of ourselves to see ourselves as a whole, as both a subject and an object at once. That's pretty much what this whole book is about. So we don't access being in itself of any object. We cannot see objects for what they are in themselves, and we're referred back to ourselves. We define objects by their meaning to us. We define the cup by its use as a cup, and so on. This is important. This idea of that the objects that we see in the world refer back to ourselves. So when we define objects by what they mean to us, okay, that we're imposing ourselves on those objects in a certain way. That's what we mean when we say that they refer back to us. The other, who we apprehend as an object, refers back to a totally different unification of experiences. And in this sense, it negates mine. Okay? So the inaccessibility of the other is an absence. He escapes nature, Sartre writes. He seems outside of the continuity and wholeness of nature. Because again, we're centralizing things in terms of ourselves. But now we have this problem of others, and they're centralizing all the same objects that we might see in terms of their point of view. So Sartre writes that the other is a self that is not myself. So it has the structure of a negation. I construct the other as an object, and yet it is as the object of my thoughts that I consider him. Okay? This is why I started with the review of how Sartre clarifies Descartes' cogito, if I don't edit it out. Now remember that when Descartes claims to reflect on himself, he's actually reflecting on the act of thinking. Excuse me. Sartre modifies this by establishing the source of this representation as residing in the for itself as opposed to the mind-body dualism of the other. This is tricky to disentangle because what he's ultimately getting at here is that the other is not a specific example of any particular person. Rather, it is a structure of our consciousness. Sartre writes that the other is one who is not me and the one who I am not. Notice the use of the words I and me, and notice the similarity with to a being that is what it is not and not what it is. The internal states of the other do not directly cause the experience I have when I sense their thoughts, their emotions, by observing their expressions, their gestures. I know that these various expressions refer to a unity, but this unity is beyond my grasp. It refers to an interiority that I am detached from, absolutely detached from. Now this separation is more than our separation from objects, because with objects we at least define them on our own terms by how they are useful to us or how we make them fit into our particular way of seeing the world. With the other, despite whether we even attempt to define the other on our terms, we know that the other sees us as an object. And despite our attempts at filling in the other as an object, we never inhabit their point of view. Our appearance to the other is never disclosed to us. The fact that our actions, our expressions, our gestures fill in a unified object, which is us, but this takes place in the privacy of the other's mind. And this means that it is separated from us in absolute terms. The other negates our being in that it unifies my actions into a system of meaning which I cannot see. He sees me as an object, and I cannot access this object. I am brought into a world that is absent from me. I know of an object that corresponds to me, exists, but it is empirically and intuitively unavailable to me. And this is an example of non-being. Now Sartre reviews the ways that Husserl Hegel and Heidegger deal with the problem of others. And he builds on this and takes some key points from each. So Husserl attempts to establish the existence of the other by the other's presence in the world. It is the world that guarantees his existence, insofar as when I doubt his existence, I doubt my own existence as in the world. Okay? So for Husserl, the referral to the other is the indispensable condition for the constitution of the world. That's a quote from Sartre. For Husserl, the other guarantees that the items of the world are actually there. The other reifies the world. My body is in the world too, so therein lies a direct connection. My mind is directly connected to my body, extensive with my body, and the other is on the same level as my body. So for Husserl, to doubt the other is to doubt the self. The other verifies the world, but I am an item in the world. And so the other verifies that as well. And you may have already caught the issue Sartre will have with this. There is a conflation of the subject and object here. I am an item in this world and a point of view upon it. The other confirms the existence of the same objects as I do. And I'm an object in the world as well. So there seems to be this guaranteed connection between myself and the other. But in actuality, there is still a disconnect between subjects. The other sees me as an object, not a subject. I see the other as an object, not a subject. So the world mediates two subjects for Husserl, but Sartre is pointing out, wait a minute, there's a disconnect here. Sartre writes, the other is never that empirical person who is encountered in my experience. He is a transcendent subject whom this person refers. So the problem is the connection between two transcendental subjects. Sartre accounts for the other by grounding it as a mode of consciousness. For Sartre, the other is a mode of being. It is non-reflective. And as we established, knowledge and being is one and the same without reflection, on the pre-reflective level. So the other is brought about in us by the presence of the other. In this sense, the being for others resides in us. We are responsible for our shame. The other elicits this mode of being in us. We have a framework for the other, and we make inferences about the interiority of the other by interpreting their exteriority. The other is not only on the other side of the world. For Sartre, the other unifies the world according to a totally different system of meaning that is totally unavailable to us. For Sartre, the world is a bridge to nowhere. For Husserl, the world is the ground of knowledge of oneself as well as the other. Husserl argues against solipsism that the other's existence is as sure as that of the world. And Husserl includes in the world my psychophysical existence. So, which basically is like your subjectivity. Your subjectivity fused with your objectivity. So Husserl, the mediation is the world. Okay, that's the mediation between the for itself and the other. For Hegel, the mediation is the other. So Sartre inherits a lot of his thinking from Hegel, especially the master-slave dialectic. And so a lot of how Sartre sees relations with others has to do with conflict. There is a struggle to make the other an object in our world. And as we become an object in theirs, we struggle to reframe our situation as to assert our agency over the other so that they remain objectified. Sartre begins to introduce Hegel's ideas on the other by outlining what's involved in self-consciousness. He brings up these phrases, myself equals myself, or I am I, which represents the self itself apprehending itself. And that's not on the level of knowledge, because there's no disconnect between subject and object there. When I say I am I posit myself as an object before I could apprehend myself as an object. I am I has certainty but lacks truth. For it to be true, its own existence for itself would have to appear as an independent object. So this is where the other steps in. Bear with me here. I know this is a bit much. For Hegel, the other is indispensable, not to the constitution of the world, but for the very existence of my consciousness as self-consciousness. That's a quote from Sartre on page 319. It is by the very fact of being me that I exclude the other. Okay? The other appears along with myself, since self-consciousness is identical with itself by exclusion of every other. For Hegel, the road of interiority passes through the other. My being for itself depends on the being of the other. Insofar as one is for itself, he is opposed to the other. So those go hand in hand. It is through the other that I exist for myself. It is this conflict, it is this opposition to the other that allows me to exist for myself. That's what it means to exist for myself. Okay. Now, in my first video on Sartre, I mentioned the difference between the words I and me. This is something I talk about a lot. I corresponds to my agency, while the word me corresponds to the object that I am. And this, in many ways, is adopted by Sartre from Hegel. Me is an object. The other is another me, and reveals that I am me. I am an object for myself in the other. The other offers a recognition of my being. It is the consciousness of the other that mediates between my consciousness that I am and the object that is me. I realize myself as an object because I see the other as an object. This realization penetrates me. It reveals that we are both an item in the world and a point of view upon it. We are revealed as an appearance to the other. The other is an appearance to us. But this affects us in the heart of our being. And so far as it affects us in the heart of our being, it affects us as we are for ourselves. It conditions us in the way we apprehend ourselves as pneuma, as having an interiority. Sartre finds an issue with Hegel here. Again, it's a conflation of subject with object. Sartre writes, according to Hegel, the other is an object, and I apprehend myself as an object in the other. But one of these affirmations destroys the other. In order for me to be able to appear to myself as an object in the other, I would have to apprehend the other as subject. That is, to apprehend him in his inferiority. But insofar as the other appears to me as object, my objectivity for him cannot appear to me. Okay, that's again this conflation of subject and object. On 329, Sartre writes, if we are to refute solipsism, then my relation to the other is first and fundamentally a relation of being to being, not knowledge to knowledge. Okay, that's the key of this whole chapter. Okay, it's an ontological bond with the other. It doesn't exist on the level of knowledge. With Husserl, there is an attempt to ground the other as in the world, as I am in the world. To doubt the other is to doubt the world for Husserl. With Hegel, the other is a mediation for my own self-consciousness. Now, these attempts fail to extend certainty of knowledge to the other. And Heidegger approaches the constitution of the other through an ontological solidarity. So this is where Heidegger kind of comes in. And this brings us closer to Sartre's position because Sartre establishes the existence of the other on the level of being, not knowledge. It is being for others that results from the initial internal negation of the for itself. This is because to be for myself is to oppose the other. Sartre advances the sense of conflict and struggle from Hegel, but reframes it in terms of being, and he takes that from Heidegger. Now, Sartre writes on 332, the original relation of the other and my consciousness is not the you and me. It is the we. Heidegger's being with is not the clear and distinct position of an individual confronting another individual. It's not knowledge. Okay? This leads us to the last section of the chapter titled The Look. So, look. Sartre writes that the problem of the others has generally been treated as if the primary relation by which the other is discovered is objectness. That is, as the other were first revealed, directly or indirectly, to our perception. So Sartre is pointing out that this issue of others is we're trying to decipher an actual body, an empirical encounter with another person, and we're trying to unpack that and trying to affirm our knowledge of the other's mind by the way we interact with people in our face-to-face relations. So for Sartre, the other is revealed as a relation between my consciousness to the other's consciousness. Subject to subject. That's what's important. That's what we're trying to get to. The other is something we encounter in everyday reality. Sartre is not simply generalizing all of the people as capital O other. He's referring to the aspect of life in a world that is perceived by others. So the other is an aspect of being. The other is a subject with awareness that integrates objects into its own organization. And Sartre uses this imagery of a man in the park. There is a park bench, pavement, grass, trees, and so on. We see the man as both an object and a man. As an object, Sartre claims that we register his presence as if he were part of a still life. I mean, an object among objects. He is beside the benches, a few yards from the lawn, and so on. As an object among objects, we see him as part of a series of indifferent relations. Seeing him as a man, however, changes the series of indifferent relations between objects, and suddenly the man centralizes the scene around him. We are given a relation without parts, taken as a whole. The benches, the lawn, the trees, and other objects become organized around him, organized through his perception and situation of which I cannot grasp. In this sense, the surrounding objects are not grouped towards me, rather they flee me. On 343, Sartre writes, "The appearance of the other in the world corresponds therefore to a fixed sliding of the whole universe, to a decentralization of the world which undermines the centralization which I am simultaneously effecting." Okay? That's important. He describes the other as introducing a drain into my world. Okay? Yet this condition of being in the world destabilized by the other, this drain in which the items of the world flee me, can be reclaimed as a fixed object. So there's this kind of meta situation. It is recovered by my ability to posit it as an object. It becomes for me once again. This is not to say that I nullify the decentralization that the other introduces into my world. Rather, it means that the decentralization brought about by the other becomes an object for me. Now, as we already covered, the other as an object that sees what I see remains merely probable. The other as subject refers to what Sartre describes as the permanent possibility of being seen by the other. Sartre writes, "It is in and through the revelation of my being as object for the other that I must be able to apprehend the presence of his being as subject." Now, I cannot be an object for an object. The other as subject refers to what Sartre describes as the permanent possibility of being seen by the other. For Sartre, the truth of seeing the other is being seen by the other. The bond of subject to subject is a bond of being, not knowing. Now, being seen does not require a meeting of the eyes. If you think you're alone and you hear something, some rustling of branches, a sound of a footstep, these experiences elicit the possibility of being seen, and an awareness of yourself as an object unfolds from that. We may have a sense of a direction a sound came from, and this represents the point of view of another person. It represents the eye of the other person. It's the support of the look. And it doesn't have to be a direct confrontation with another person. Okay? It could just be a sound. We all know that feeling of being paranoid and wondering if someone's looking at you. So Sartre introduces an example of spying through a keyhole into a scene in a room. In this situation, our consciousness is our actions. We may be motivated by curiosity or jealousy, and we think we are unseen. Our attention is outward. It's totally fixated into this other room. Our consciousness is composed of what exists beyond this door. Okay, then suddenly we realize that we've been spotted. Our consciousness immediately withdraws from this situation and turns into an awareness of ourselves as an object. Suddenly we are this body there in the world, and we feel shame. I see myself because somebody else sees me, is what Sartre writes. Now, the self as object requires the reflective consciousness, which is why Sartre describes the self in this case as merely haunting my unreflective consciousness. Which means that for Sartre, all of a sudden, as I am spotted, I become conscious of myself as escaping myself. Sartre writes that I have my foundation outside of myself. I am for myself only as I am a pure reference to the other. Okay, isn't that interesting? You feel yourself as that object centralized in the world of the other person's point of view. And that is this feeling of shame. The object that I am, as revealed by the presence of the other, is an object for the other. It is for another for itself, a different freedom, so to speak, that is not my own. Now, I could be mistaken about being seen. Perhaps it was only the wind that made the sound of tree branches moving. I still became an awareness of myself as an object, as seen. Okay, this helps illustrate the decoupling of the object that is the other, from which I merely have probable knowledge of, from the other as subject, which is this being for others that's just hardwired into who we are. It doesn't necessarily exist in the body of another person, but in the possibility of being seen. We have all heard of the studies on human behavior, which suggests that our behavior is affected when there is an image of a face in a room. We might be less likely to steal something in that case. And if you think of yourself doing something mischievous that you don't want anyone else to see you do, you may have this heightened awareness of yourself as an object, where as soon as you hear any noise, you mistakenly assume that someone is looking at you. This aspect of being is what Sartre is grounding the other in. And notice how it doesn't depend on the other as object. It is a self-contained, as an awareness of oneself with the possibility of being seen. And it is never eyes that see us. It is the other as subject. Sartre goes deeper into this. Suppose we are spying through the keyhole. We hear a noise down the hall. We feel shame, totally absorb our body. Then we realize that there's nothing there. We haven't been seen. But the nature of the situation reveals a kind of paranoia that may emerge. Suddenly, we may decide to stop spying through the keyhole because we're paranoid. Suddenly, the presence of the other seems to exist everywhere. Is that sound a person? Is that sound a person? And so you get what Sartre's getting at here. Sartre goes on to discuss presence and absence from this. And I don't know if I'm going to spend too much time on this. If we say that Pierre is absent from this room, it determines his presence somewhere else, and that there would be some reason for him to be in this room. We don't say that the Queen of England is absent from the room if there's no reason for her to be here. Absence is not a nothingness determined by place. Rather, we determine Pierre to be absent from a place he may determine himself to be. This has to do with Pierre as a subject. He may agree to meet me at a certain time and location, and when he fails to meet me, he is absent. For Pierre to be absent in relation to someone else is a particular way of him being present.